I'm Brian Roach, an economist here at the Global Development and Environment Institute at Tufts University, and I'm here today with Dr. Daniel Kahneman. Dr. Kahneman is here today because we have awarded him the 2010 Leontief Prize for advancing the frontiers of economic thought. Dr. Kahneman is a psychologist who has provided numerous insights on how people actually behave and its implications for economics. And Dr. Kahneman was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2002.
The title of this year's Leontief event is Development and Well-Being in Times of Crisis. And much of your research has focused on understanding and measuring human well-being. And you participated in the recent Sarkozy Commission on Social and Environmental Measures. And one of the recommendations of the commission was that we need to include subjective measures of well-being as well as the traditional objective measures like GDP. So I was wondering if you could comment on the types of subjective data we should be collecting and why such information is important.
Well, why it is important, it's because really people want to achieve well-being. It certainly is one of their goals. And the question of whether society helps people achieve their goals is self-evidently an important question. So the idea that you could just stop with economic growth strikes me as superficial. It clearly struck Sarkozy as superficial too. And so my impression is that this is not yet uncontroversial, but there is really a lot of progress in accepting that what people want, that utility should be defined by what people really want, and not merely by the fact that they purchase things.
Okay, thanks. Let's see, your research has discovered that people can be surprisingly poor at predicting how different experiences will affect their utility. And you've noted how decision or expected utility doesn't necessarily match up with experienced or remembered utility. And I was wondering if you could talk about the implications of these findings for, say, the proper role of government and economic policy in general.
Well, there is the dreaded P word, so the question is, to what extent, what kind of paternalism is clearly, if people are poorer at predicting what they will want later than somebody else, that creates a moral problem. And I think that for Chicago's type economists, there is no problem because rational people know what they will want, and therefore you don't need to protect them against their current choices. But if people don't know what they will want later, and they now make commitments that they may regret later, that does, I think, potentially create a role for government. And it creates a dilemma because nobody wants to, freedom is a sacred value, a very important value, but you have to begin balancing values against each other if you need to protect people against their preferences. And I think all of this topic, and that really is the core of behavioral economics to some extent, and it follows directly from the ideas of behavioral economics, that people do need protection against themselves, not only against others. That is, I think, one of the themes of the book Nudge, which is doing extremely well, and that notion of, and it's clear that the authors of Nudge, both of them friends of mine, Dick Thaler and Cass Sunstein, they really worried about that very problem, the problem of how paternalistic can you be before you become authoritarian. Okay. So they end up with that libertarian paternalism phrase. But in fact, they recommend a great deal of protection for people against themselves as well as against others.
Okay. What about the role in the government on educational issues? Do you think people can be educated to make better decisions?
Well, I'm not responding enthusiastically because I'm not sure that a course on that topic in high schools would really accomplish a lot. Okay. I think that the seriousness of mind, clearly depends on education, but it's not that I think you can segregate the topic of decision making. It's a useful thing to do, but it's very minor in terms of the impact that it will have.
Okay. Given that we allow government to influence people's well-being, what would you say is the most effective government policy we could institute to increase well-being?
Well, I mean, clearly increasing security would be the obvious one, because this does have a major effect on the quality of life.
Okay. Meaning economic security?
Well, it's economic security, health security. I mean, in general. But I'm speaking as someone who didn't grow up in this culture. So I have sort of European sensitivities, and if you have European sensitivities, then the individualism and the idea that people ought to be left to fend for themselves is almost offensive. But clearly, in the American culture, there is a much bigger problem about paternalism than there is, say, in Western Europe.
Okay. On a different topic, you did a paper several years ago on the ability of people to assess low probability, high consequence events. And the paper's conclusion was that people need significant contextual information in order to evaluate risk. The paper didn't mention climate change, but clearly it has some implications for climate change, particularly catastrophic climate change. And it seems that scientists have a problem nowadays in communicating the risk of climate change, particularly to the American public. Like, I've seen a recent survey that shows that the majority of Americans now don't even believe in climate change. So from my perspective, as well as the scientific community's perspective, do you have any ideas for how we can communicate the risk of climate change to the American public?
I think that climate change is just one of many topics. There is a book out recently, I think, with the title Denialism, which is that the attitude of disbelief in science is widespread. So you cannot, I think, politically, if politicians declare that climate change is a major issue, then that would convince the public. But I don't think you can really teach the public when a majority, I think, of Americans believe in many things that... I mean, there are more people who believe in angels, I think, in personal angels, than there are who believe in evolution or in climate change. And there isn't much that you can do, I think, in that context, in the narrow context of educating people for climate change. You'd have to... This is one of those problems where you cannot start with the public. You have to start with the media, you have to start with the political establishment, and it will be, if anything, a trickle-down kind of effect. I don't think that you can create a lot of demand in the public for, pressure on politicians to do something.
So instead, we might need bold political leadership to...
We would need bold political leadership, and we would really need to educate the media, but it's mainly political. It's just keeping that in the news, keeping this topic active, and so on, with probably very little by way of political benefits, because the public does not see this as a problem that needs to be solved. So it's defining a problem and then trying to solve it, and then the solution will be expensive. So politically it's going to be costly, but I don't think that it can be done any other way.
Okay.